The fire took everything I owned in one night. My mother took 90 seconds to decide it wasn't her problem. I'm Ivy Myers, 33, a hospice nurse who has held more dying hands than I can count, and at 3 in the morning I stood in the Larkspur parking lot watching the second floor of my life turn black. Smoke was still in my hair when I called my parents. My mom answered, half asleep, annoyed, and said the words, "I'll never forget." Then a man in a gray jacket walked up, a fire investigator, and asked who had a key to my apartment last week, because they'd found something at the scene. A few days later, in a quiet county office, what he lifted out of a sealed evidence bag made my blood run cold. And what I did with it, 48 hours after that, none of them saw coming. Welcome back to Hidden Family Revenge, where the people who underestimate a quiet woman always learn her value too late, and where the truth, once written down, doesn't burn. If a story ever made you sit up straighter, drop a comment and be sure to subscribe. Stay with me. This one turns on a single key. The firefighters were rolling their hoses when the man in the gray jacket found me. I was wearing a stranger's coat, borrowed from a neighbor who'd fled in her socks. My hands weren't shaking. That surprised me. 12 years of night shifts teach your body to stay calm when everyone else is falling apart. He introduced himself as Frank Delgado, county fire investigator, and he didn't offer the soft voice people use on victims. He offered a notebook and steady eyes. He asked how long I'd lived there. 3 years, I told him. He asked if I'd been home. No, I'd been on a double at the medical center, and the manager called me at 2. He wrote all of it down, then crouched by the burned-out window and photographed the same spot again and again. I followed his line of sight. He was shooting the corner where my filing cabinet used to stand, the metal one where I kept every important paper I owned. "Ms. Myers," he said, still crouched, "do you keep anything flammable near that cabinet?" I said no. Cleaning supplies were under the kitchen sink, on the other side of the unit. He nodded slowly, like the answer mattered more than I understood. A younger officer came over and murmured something I couldn't hear, and Delgado's jaw tightened. He stood, brushed ash from his knees, and looked at me with an expression I'd seen on doctors right before bad news. "I'm going to need to talk to you again tomorrow," he said. "Get some sleep if you can." I told him nurses don't sleep. We just wait for the next alarm. He almost smiled. Then he looked back at that scorched corner one more time, and something in the set of his shoulders told me this wasn't going to be filed under bad luck. I didn't know it yet, but the corner that burned hottest was the corner that would burn my family down. Before Delgado, before any of it, I'd made the call every daughter makes. Standing on that curb at 3 a.m., watching the last of my life smolder, I did the thing children do without thinking. I called my mom. It rang 4 times. When Sharon Myers finally picked up, her voice was thick with sleep and already sharpened with irritation, because in our family being woken up was a bigger crime than being burned out. "Ivy, it's the middle of the night," she said. I told her the apartment was gone. There was a pause, and I let myself hope, for exactly one breath, that she would say, "Get in the car. We're coming." Instead, she sighed the sigh I'd heard my whole life, the one that meant I was being dramatic. "Well, that's terrible. But honestly, it's not our problem," she said. "You should have been more careful." "Not our problem. You should have been more careful." I stood there with soot on my teeth and let those words land. In the background, I heard my father, Ray, mutter something about insurance and roll back over. Then my mother asked the question that would haunt the next 2 months. Her voice changed, dropped the sleep, got careful. "Ivy," she said, "did you have any of Nana's papers in there? The ones from the house?" I said I had to go. I hung up before she could answer, because the nurse in me had just noticed a symptom that didn't fit. My apartment was ash. My whole life was gone, and the first thing my mother worried about wasn't me. It was a stack of my dead grandmother's paperwork. I filed that away, the way I file everything, and I turned back toward the man in the gray jacket. By 9 that morning, I was at the Route 9 Motor Lodge, A place that smelled like carpet cleaner and other people's cigarettes, filling out an insurance form on a bedspread. My phone rang. It was my sister Delia, and she was crying before I even said hello. "Oh my God, Ivy, are you okay? I heard, this is awful," she said, all in one breath. I told her I was fine, just tired. Then, before I could finish a sentence about where I'd sleep, she pivoted. "Listen, the box," she said. "Nana's box. The metal one with all her documents. Did that make it? And the little fireproof case?" I sat up straighter. My sister lived 20 minutes away and hadn't visited my apartment in over a year. She shouldn't have known I had a fireproof case at all. I asked how she knew about that. She laughed too fast and said Mom must have mentioned it. Then she said the thing my family always says to me, the sentence they've used my whole life to excuse leaving me alone. "You'll be fine, Ivy," she said warmly. "You always land on your feet." You always land on your feet. It's meant to sound like a compliment. It's actually a permission slip. It means we don't have to help her. She's strong. She'll manage. And I'd worn it like a collar since I was 9 years old. I told Delia I had to take another call. I didn't. I just needed the room quiet so I could think. My apartment burned 12 hours ago. My mother wanted the papers. Now my sister wanted the papers. Nobody in my family had asked me a single real question about whether I still had a place to sleep. That's when I stopped grieving and started paying attention. To understand why a stack of paper mattered more to my family than my life, you have to go back 3 months, to the night my grandmother died. Nana Ruth was 84, and for the last 11 months of her life, I was the one who moved in, who managed her medications, who bathed her and read to her, and sat up through the bad nights. Delia visited twice. My parents came for holidays and left before the dishes were done. I didn't resent it then. Caring for the dying is my calling, not a favor I keep score on. But Nana kept score. About 6 weeks before she passed, she asked me to drive her to see a lawyer named Nora Beckett. She didn't tell me why. She just held my hand in the waiting room and said, "You stayed. I see who stays." A month after the funeral, Nora called the family together and read the new will. The house on Sycamore, the one Nana had lived in for 50 years, worth about $300,000, was left to me. Not divided. Not shared. To me. Delia stood up so fast her chair fell over. She said Nana wasn't in her right mind. She said I'd manipulated a dying old woman. My mother said we'd discuss it privately, which in our family means pressure the strong one until she folds. What none of them knew was that I'd already been careful. Weeks earlier, I'd had the will notarized, made certified copies, scanned every page, and put the original somewhere it could never be touched. I'm a nurse. I document everything. It's not paranoia. It's the habit that keeps people alive. And it was about to keep the truth alive, too. The house was in probate now, the hearing not far off, and my family wanted those papers gone. Then my apartment, the place where they assumed the will was sitting, caught fire. That afternoon, I drove across town to my parents' house, not because I expected comfort, but because the motel wanted a card I was trying to save for real expenses, and family is supposed to mean a spare room. My mother met me at the door and didn't open it all the way. Behind her, the house was warm and lit and smelled like coffee. "Ivy, we just don't have the space right now," she said. I pointed out that my old room was still my old room. She said they used it for storage, for Delia's kids' things, for a dozen small reasons that added up to no. My father appeared behind her, hands in his pockets, and said the sentence he uses to avoid every hard thing. "You know how to handle yourself, kiddo." Then my mother said it again, softer this time, almost kind, which made it worse. "It's really not our problem to solve, honey. You'll figure it out. You always do." Not our problem. Twice, in one day. I stood on the porch of the house I grew up in and understood something with total clarity. They weren't cold because they were cruel. They were cold because being cold to me was free. I never made them pay for it. I always figured it out. Always landed on my feet. Always let them off the hook. So I did something I'd never done before. I stopped asking. I said, "You're right. I'll handle it." And I meant it in a way she didn't hear. I drove back to the Route 9 lodge, sat on that ugly bedspread, and opened a fresh document on my phone. At the top, I typed a single word: timeline. If my family wanted to make my crisis my problem alone, then I was going to solve it the way I solve everything, completely. The insurance adjuster came to the lodge 2 days later, a tired woman named Paula with a clipboard and low expectations. Most fire victims, she told me, have nothing. No inventory, no receipts, no proof of what they lost. They stand in the ashes and try to remember from memory, and they get pennies. Then I opened my laptop, the one thing I'd had at work the night of the fire, and showed her the folder. Photographs of every room, receipts scanned and dated. A spreadsheet of major possessions with serial numbers, because 3 years ago I'd done a renter's inventory in one long Sunday and never let it lapse. Paula looked at the screen, then looked at me, and her whole posture changed. "Honey," she said, "in 11 years I have never seen a claim this clean." That word again. Documentation. My family thought my careful habits were fussiness, the boring quirk of a woman with no life. Paula thought they were the difference between getting made whole and getting nothing. She flagged the claim to move fast. Then, almost as an afterthought, she frowned at her paperwork. "Just so you know," she said, "the fire marshal's report has your cause listed as undetermined, pending investigation. It's not marked accidental." I asked what that meant. She said, carefully, that accidental fires get closed quick, that pending investigation usually means somebody upstairs isn't satisfied it was an accident. She gathered her things and left me sitting with that. Undetermined. Pending. I thought about Frank Delgado crouched in the ash, photographing my filing cabinet from 6 angles. I thought about my mother's careful voice asking about papers, and I opened my timeline document and added a new line in the plain, flat language I use for charting a patient's decline. Cause of fire, not an accident. Everything after that, I wrote down. I know that feeling, the one where the people who are supposed to catch you decide you're too strong to fall, so they just let you drop and call it a compliment. If you've ever been handed your own crisis and told it built character, stay with me, because the man in the gray jacket was about to hand me the first piece of a very ugly truth. Comment the word documented if you've ever had to prove what everyone in your family tried to deny. Delgado called on the 3rd day and asked me to come to the county building. He had a diagram laid out on a wide table, a floor plan of my apartment marked with red and orange and hard black lines. He didn't waste time. "Ms. Myers, I've been doing this 26 years, he said, "and I follow a national standard for how these get determined. It's called NFPA 921. It keeps me honest." He tapped the plan. "In an accidental fire," he explained, "you usually find a clear source, wiring, a stove, a space heater, and the burn spreads outward in a way that tells a story. My fire didn't tell that story. It had a single point of origin, low in the corner by my filing cabinet, nowhere near any electrical source. The burn pattern there was deep and localized, the kind you get when something is poured, not sparked. He said the lab had samples out for testing, but he already knew what they'd find. I asked him to say it plainly, the way I ask doctors to. He looked at me and did. "Someone started this on purpose, Ms. Myers, in your home, against the wall where you kept your papers." The room felt very quiet. I've delivered death notices to families and watched the floor drop out from under them, and I recognized the feeling arriving in my own chest. But I didn't let it show, because the nurse in me had already moved to the next question, the practical one, the one that mattered. Delgado asked it before I could. He leaned forward, pen ready, and said the sentence that split my family in half. "So here's what I need to know," he said. "Who had a key to that apartment last week?" I opened my mouth to say only me, and then I remembered, and my stomach turned to ice, because the answer was not only me. I made myself answer it like a chart, in order, no emotion. The building manager had a master key, standard for any complex. I had my own. And then there was the spare. A week before the fire, my sister Delia had called me, sweet as pie, asking if she could borrow my spare key to water my plants while I pulled a stretch of doubles. It had struck me as odd even then. I told Delgado the truth, that I'd hesitated on the phone because I don't really keep plants. Just one stubborn pothos that survives on neglect and spite. But Delia had insisted she was in the area and wanted to help, and I was exhausted and behind, and I let it go. I gave her the spare from the lockbox by the mailboxes. Delgado wrote her name down and underlined it. Then I told him the part that made my own hands go still. 2 days before the fire, something about the whole thing had nagged at me enough that I'd called a locksmith. I'd made an appointment to rekey the entire unit, to quietly get that spare out of circulation, because a feeling I couldn't name had been sitting on my chest. The locksmith's first opening was in 3 days. The fire came the night before he was scheduled to arrive. Delgado stopped writing and looked at me for a long moment. "So you sensed something was wrong," he said, "and you moved to protect yourself. You just didn't have enough runway." That was exactly it. I'd seen the red flag. I'd acted on it. And the person who set this fire had simply moved faster than a locksmith's calendar. I asked Delgado what my sister could possibly have done with a key to my apartment. He said that was the whole question, wasn't it? And told me not to contact her yet. I didn't sleep that night. I lay on the lodge bed doing what I always do when a case is sliding, running the whole chart in my head, looking for the thing I'd missed, and around 2 in the morning it surfaced. The camera. My building had a single security camera in the second-floor hallway, mounted above the fire door, angled right at the row of apartment doors that included mine. I'd walked past it 1,000 times. If Delia had used that key, the camera had seen her do it. I called the building manager the second his office opened, and the news was a race against a clock. The system, he told me, only kept footage for 14 days before it recorded over itself. The fire had been 6 days ago, which meant the night before the fire was still on the server. Barely, but it would start getting overwritten within the week. He hemmed. He said pulling footage was really a police matter, that he didn't want liability, that maybe I should wait. I told him, in the calm, flat voice I use on families who want to give up too early, that a criminal investigation was already open, that Frank Delgado's name was on it, and that "we lost the footage because we waited" was not a sentence either of us wanted to say to a judge. He went quiet, then said he'd meet me at the office. I drove the 11 miles from the lodge to Larkspur at 4 in the morning with the heater on and my jaw set. The manager was waiting in the lobby in a robe, and together we sat at his little monitor and scrubbed backward through the timestamps toward the night before my life burned. My hand was steady on the mouse. It was the rest of me that wasn't. We preserved the footage that morning, copied it to a drive, and handed the original chain over to Delgado, untouched, the way he'd told me to. I didn't watch all of it there in the lobby. I made myself wait and do it right. But that same afternoon, my sister made a mistake that told me more than any camera. Delia texted me, working the concerned sister angle again, and she got chatty. She wrote that she'd heard the fire, started over by your file cabinet in the corner. And wasn't that strange? And did I lose all of Nana's documents in there? I read it 3 times. I had never told my family where the fire started. Delgado had been blunt that the point of origin was being held back from everyone outside the investigation, my family included, so no loose rumor could taint the case. A couple of the first responders might have their own guesses, but none of them knew my sister, and Delia had sworn up and down she'd had no contact with any investigator. It didn't prove she'd lit the match, but there was no innocent way for her to know which corner burned first, and she'd just put it in writing. 10 years ago, I might have called her screaming. Even a year ago, I might have called Mom in tears, asking how this could be happening. But something in me had gone very still and very clear. I did not accuse her. I did not tip my hand. I wrote back something soft and vague, thanked her for checking in, and said the investigation was ongoing. Then I screenshotted her message, logged the date and time, and forwarded it to Delgado with one line. She knows where it started. He wrote back within the hour. Interesting. Keep everything. Don't engage. I set the phone down and noticed my own reflection in the dark motel window, and I looked, for the first time in a long time, like someone who was not about to fold. My family had spent my whole life betting I'd stay quiet. They'd bet wrong. The next piece came from the last place I expected, at the last place I wanted to be. A great aunt of ours passed that week, and the family gathered at a funeral home across the county. I went because Nana would have wanted me there, and because I've learned that people say the most honest things while balancing paper plates of ham. I kept to the edges. That's where Delia's next-door neighbor, a talkative man named Gary who fixes small engines, found me by the coffee. He didn't know any of the backstory. He just wanted to make conversation, and he mentioned, laughing, that my brother-in-law Kurt had borrowed his lawnmower gas can a couple weeks back and returned it bone dry. Told him he could have at least filled it back up, Gary said, chuckling. Man borrows a full can, brings it back empty. What's a fella do all that gas on? His lawn's the size of a stamp. I kept my face pleasant and my voice light, and asked when that was, exactly. Gary thought about it and named the week of the fire. I thanked him, refilled my coffee I didn't want, and stepped outside to the parking lot to breathe. Gasoline. A borrowed can, returned empty. The week my apartment burned from a poured accelerant. I didn't have a recording and I didn't need one. I had a witness who'd tell the truth without even knowing what he'd witnessed. I called Delgado from the funeral home lot. He listened, quiet, then said the lab had come back that very morning. The samples from my filing cabinet corner were positive for a gasoline range accelerant. Everything was pointing one direction now, and the arrow had my sister's married name on it. I looked back at the funeral home, at the warm windows full of my family, and I understood I was already alone in there. The next morning, I drove to the bank on Main Street and went down to the safe deposit vault because it was time to hold the thing they thought they'd burned. When Nana asked me to keep her papers safe, I hadn't put them in my apartment. I'd put the originals here, behind a steel door and a key only I held. The clerk led me to the little private room, set the long metal box on the table, and left me alone. I opened it. On top was the original will, notarized, embossed, the raised seal still crisp under my thumb, leaving the house on Sycamore to me in language no fire could smudge. My family had spent a week clawing for these papers. They'd burned my apartment believing the will was inside. And here it sat, untouched, cool to the touch, more real than ever. But that wasn't what stopped my breath. Underneath the will was an envelope with my name on it in Nana's shaky hand, a letter I'd never seen, sealed the day she signed. I opened it there in that quiet little room. She wrote that she knew what would happen when she was gone. She wrote that she'd watched her own daughter, my mother, spend a lifetime keeping the peace by feeding me to my sister, and that she was sorry she hadn't stopped it sooner. Then she wrote the line I carried through everything that came after. If they fight you for the house, don't shrink. You were the one who stayed. The fire burned my copy. It never touched the original, and it never touched what my grandmother had already seen coming about her own daughters. I sat with that letter a long time. Then I slid the will and the letter into a folder, signed the vault log, and walked back out into the daylight with my spine straight. They had a key to my apartment. I had the one thing they could never reach. Sitting in my car outside the bank, I let myself feel the size of the choice in front of me. I had two roads. The quiet one was to say nothing, let the probate hearing come, present the original will, take the house, and walk away, while the criminal case ground along in the background without me. It would be clean. It would be safe. It was exactly what my family expected me to do, because keeping the peace was the family religion, and I'd been raised in the church. The other road was harder. It meant fully cooperating with Delgado, handing over every screenshot and timeline and witness, letting the arson case and the probate case arrive at the same place at the same time, in the open, with everyone watching. It meant my sister might go to prison. It meant my mother would learn that the daughter she'd bet on staying silent had been documenting every step. For most of my life, I would have chosen the quiet road. It's the one that keeps the family together, or keeps the appearance of it, which we'd always treated as the same thing. But I thought about Nana's line, "Don't shrink." You were the one who stayed. Peace built on my silence had never been peace. It had just been my family's comfort, paid for with my share. I started the car. I called Delgado and told him I was in, all the way, whatever the case needed from me. He said good, that it took people a while to decide, and that most of them decided to look away. I told him I'm a hospice nurse. I don't look away from hard things. I sit with them until they're finished. Then I drove back to the lodge and started organizing everything I had, because the finishing was going to take all of it. There's a specific kind of quiet that arrives right before you stop being the family doormat, and I found mine in a bank vault, holding my grandmother's handwriting. If you've ever been told to just let it go for the sake of the family, stay with me, because peace that's built on your silence was never really peace. It was just their comfort billed to you. Subscribe before the next part. Trust me, you're going to want to see my sister's face when the will she thought she burned lands on the table. My mother called that evening, and her voice had changed into the sweet, careful tone she saves for when she wants something. She asked how I was holding up, then didn't wait for the answer. She got to it. "Ivy, I've been thinking," she said. "Did you ever find any of Nana's papers after the fire? The will and all that? Because if it burned up, well, maybe that's the universe telling us to just split the house fair and move on." I held the phone and listened to my mother suggest that my grandmother's dying wish going up in smoke would be a convenient gift. I said the investigation was ongoing and I couldn't discuss it. She pressed. And then she made the mistake that told me how deep this went. Trying to prove she cared, she said, "Delia told me your apartment was always such a mess. Papers everywhere. No wonder it caught." I went very still. Delia had told everyone, repeatedly, that she'd never been inside my apartment. She'd borrowed a key to water plants from the mailbox lockbox, she claimed, and never gone farther than the door. But my mother had just described the inside of my unit, the papers, the layout, in Delia's words. You can't describe the inside of a place you never entered. Somewhere between the two of them, a story had a hole in it, and I'd just watched my mother fall through it. I kept my voice even and asked when Delia had been inside. My mother backpedaled instantly, said she must have meant from years ago, changed the subject to the weather, but it was too late. I hung up and added the line to my timeline. Mom describes interior of apartment, in Delia's words. My family wasn't just leaving me to burn. Some of them had known where the match was. Delgado asked me to come in again, and this time a detective sat with us, a woman named Ruiz, with kind eyes and a hard mouth. They walked me through how a case like this gets built so it holds up in court. The accelerant lab work, the sealed evidence, the chain of custody that means no one can claim it was tampered with. Then Delgado said they'd recovered a personal item from the point of origin, something that survived the fire because it was metal, and they needed me to identify it. Ruiz set a sealed evidence bag on the table. Inside was a keychain, warped and discolored by heat but unmistakable. A small brass lighthouse on a ring, the enamel bubbled but the shape intact. My whole body went cold, the real kind of cold, the kind the title of my own life could have been named for. I knew that keychain. I'd bought it. 2 summers ago, on a trip to the coast, I'd bought 2 matching lighthouse keychains in a gift shop, one for me and one for my sister, because as kids we used to beg our parents to take us to see the lighthouse, and it was the one good memory we shared. I'd given Delia hers at Christmas. She'd put her spare keys on it. And here it was, melted into the exact corner where someone had poured gasoline and lit my life on fire. Delgado watched my face and didn't rush me. "Ms. Myers," he said quietly, "do you recognize this?" I told him yes. I told him whose it was, and how I knew, and where I'd bought it, and my voice didn't shake, though everything under it did. What he'd found at the scene, the thing that made my blood run cold, was the little lighthouse I'd given my sister to remember when we still loved each other. Ruiz asked if I was sure, And I was. There was no other lighthouse keychain in the world that ended up in the corner of my apartment. I could have sat in that room and unraveled. Instead, I did what I do at a bedside when the monitors go wrong. I narrowed down to the next right action. I gave them the story of the keychain, the gift shop receipt still buried in an old email, the Christmas I'd handed it over. I gave them the dates, the texts, the funeral home tip about the gas can. I did not call my sister to scream at her. I did not call my mother to demand answers. My weapon was never going to be my voice raised in a parking lot. It was going to be a clean, patient record that a judge could read. Delgado told me they had enough now to bring Delia in for questioning, and that the case would move to the prosecutor. Then he asked, gently, whether I wanted to warn my family, whether I needed to prepare them. I thought about that, and I decided no. Not because I wanted an ambush, but because every time I'd tried to handle things privately with my family, they'd used the privacy to pressure me into silence. This time the truth was going to arrive where they couldn't manage it, couldn't spin it, couldn't decide it wasn't their problem. It was going to arrive in a courtroom, on the record, with a judge and a fire investigator and the whole family in the seats. I asked Delgado when the probate hearing was. He checked. 7 days out. Both cases, the fire and the will, were about to breathe the same air in the same room. I thanked him and went back to the lodge to get ready for the hardest morning of my life. Delia must have felt the ground shifting, because she went on the offensive the only way she knew how, with her mouth. Over the next few days, my phone lit up with calls from relatives I hadn't heard from in years, each of them repeating a version of the same story. Delia was telling the whole family that I'd manipulated a confused old woman into changing her will, that I'd isolated Nana during those 11 months so I could work on her, that I was greedy and cold and had probably been careless enough to burn my own apartment down chasing an insurance payout. An aunt actually asked me, in a syrupy voice, whether I'd considered how this looks. My sister's weapon was gossip and public shame, the family court of whispers where she'd always won because I'd never fought back. She was good at it. She'd had a lifetime of practice, and she was betting that I'd do what I always did. Go quiet. Go small. Let the story harden around me because defending myself felt like making a scene. But I wasn't playing that game anymore. Gossip lives in the dark and dies in the light, and I was about to turn on every lamp in the building. I didn't argue with a single relative. I didn't send one defensive text. I just said, calmly, to anyone who asked, that everything would be clear at the hearing and that I hoped they'd come. And I meant it. I wanted witnesses. My sister was trying to win in the whisper court because she'd have no chance in a real one. The more she talked, the more people she gathered into the room where the truth was going to land. She thought she was building a case against me. She was building an audience for herself. 3 days before the hearing, I met with Nora Beckett, my grandmother's lawyer, in her small office that smelled like old books and copier toner. I needed to know if the will could hold, because Delia's whole public story rested on one claim, that Nana wasn't in her right mind. Nora listened to all of it without changing expression, then opened a file and laid my worries to rest one by one. The new will, she said, had been executed properly, signed in front of 2 independent witnesses, neither of them me, neither of them family. That was intentional. And there was more. Nora had insisted, back when Nana came to her, on documenting capacity. On the day of the signing, Nana had been evaluated by her own physician, who signed a statement that she was of sound mind and understood exactly what she was doing. That statement was in the file, dated and notarized. The manipulation story didn't just have a weak leg, it had no legs at all. Then Nora told me the thing that closed the door completely. Her office kept an independent copy of the executed will in their own records, standard practice, entirely separate from mine. Even if every copy I owned had burned, even if the original had somehow been destroyed, the will existed in a lawyer's vault where no borrowed key could reach. My sister had set a fire to erase a document that lived in 3 places she'd never even thought of. Nora looked at me over her glasses and said, in the dry voice of someone who's seen families do their worst, "Ms. Myers, Whoever burned your apartment to destroy this will made a very expensive mistake. I told her I was starting to think a lot of my family had underestimated the cost of underestimating me. The night before the hearing, my father did something he never does. He came to me. He drove out to the Route 9 lodge alone, and he stood in the doorway of my room looking older than I'd ever seen him, and he asked if we could talk. I let him in. He sat on the edge of the bad chair and turned his hat in his hands and, for a moment, I thought I was going to get the apology I'd waited 33 years to hear. He got close. He said he knew things had been hard on me, that maybe they hadn't always been fair, that I'd carried more than my share with Nana. My throat tightened. Then he ruined it. So I'm asking you, he said, for the family, don't make this bigger than it has to be tomorrow. Whatever you've got, whatever's going on with the investigation, let's keep it quiet. Delia's got the kids. Your mother couldn't take it. Just take the house if that's what Nana wanted and let the rest go. There it was. Not an apology. A negotiation. He'd driven all this way not to stand with me but to ask me, one more time, to swallow it for everyone else's comfort. I looked at my father and I didn't feel angry. I felt something quieter and more final. The way you feel when a long fever finally breaks. I told him I loved him. I told him I'd spent my whole life keeping things quiet for this family, and that the quiet had never once protected me. Only them. I told him that tomorrow the truth was going to be told. All of it, and that he could sit with me or sit across from me, but it was happening either way. He put his hat on and left without another word. That same night, Delgado called with an update that turned all my scattered pieces into a single picture. The investigation had crossed the threshold from suspicion to case. The hallway footage we'd raced to preserve showed a figure entering my apartment the night before the fire. It wasn't a perfect picture. Grainy and dim, the way those cheap hallway cameras always are. But it caught her height, her build, the long tan coat she wore in every season, and in one frame, as she glanced up at the camera by the fire door, enough of her face. On its own, Delgado admitted, a good defense lawyer could have picked at it. Combined with everything else, it stopped being one grainy figure and became her. The phone records placed my brother-in-law Kurt's cell in the Larkspur neighborhood that same night, nowhere he had any business being. The gas can was documented, the accelerant lab was positive, and the melted lighthouse keychain sat in an evidence locker with my sister's name attached to every link of the chain. Delgado told me they'd brought Delia in that afternoon for formal questioning, and Delia, being Delia, had done the one thing guaranteed to sink her. She'd denied everything. Flatly, angrily. She'd looked a detective in the eye and said she had never once been inside my apartment. Never. Not to water plants, not for any reason. She'd built her whole defense on never having entered the unit. Except my mother had already described the inside of it in Delia's words, and the hallway camera had already watched her walk through the door. She'd sealed the hole in her own story shut with herself inside it. Delgado said the prosecutor was preparing charges, arson and insurance fraud among them, and that it was likely to come down within days. I asked him one thing. Would he be willing to be present at the probate hearing as a witness, if the judge allowed it? He was quiet for a second, then said he'd already planned to be there. Some cases, he said. You want to see land in person. I hung up and slept, actually slept, for the first time since the fire. Tomorrow, everything I'd written down was going to be read out loud. I saw my sister once before the hearing, and it nearly undid me, which I think is the point of telling you about it. I arrived early at the county courthouse and she was already there, sitting alone on a bench in the cold marble hallway, and for a moment she didn't see me. Her two kids were with a cousin down the hall, and Delia was staring at a piece of paper in her lap, and even from across the corridor I could read the header on it, a foreclosure notice. My sister was about to lose her house, the actual roof over her actual children, and somewhere in that terror she had decided that the answer was to take mine and Nana's, and burn whatever stood between her and safe. I understood her then, completely, for one terrible aching moment. She wasn't a cartoon villain. She was a drowning woman who'd grabbed the nearest neck and pushed it under to keep her own head up. I almost went to her. I almost sat down and said we could figure something out. That no house was worth this. That we used to beg to see the lighthouse together. And then she looked up and saw me. And whatever softness had been on her face curdled instantly into something hard and hissing. "You should have just let it go," she whispered, venom under her breath so the echoing hall wouldn't carry it. "You always have to be so perfect. This is your fault too." And the ache in my chest closed like a fist. I felt sorry for her. I did. But being sorry for someone doesn't erase what they've done, and understanding a fire doesn't unburn your home. I gave her a small nod, the kind you give a patient past saving, and I walked into the courtroom to take my seat. Inside the courtroom, I took a breath and set my folder on the table in front of me, squared it to the edge the way I square everything, and made my final decision about how this would go. I had a choice even now. I could hand the judge the will quietly, let probate do its narrow work, and keep the fire out of this room entirely, saving the arson for some later courtroom nobody in my family would attend. Nora had even offered to keep it clean and separate. But I'd thought about it all week, and I knew the truth needed to arrive here, in front of these specific people, not as an ambush, but as a reckoning conducted by the rules. My whole family had come, drawn by Delia's whisper campaign, filling the benches, ready to watch the greedy sister get what was coming to her. My mother sat beside Delia, chin up, certain. My father sat 2 rows back, alone, hat in his lap. Frank Delgado sat quietly near the aisle in a clean gray jacket, a folder of his own on his knee. I had arranged nothing theatrical. I had simply made sure that every thread, the will, the capacity evaluation, the fire report, the witness, would be available in this room if the moment called for them, all through proper channels, all on the record. I wasn't going to raise my voice. I wasn't going to make a scene. I was going to answer every question truthfully and let the facts do what facts do when you finally stop hiding them. The bailiff called us to order. The judge, a silver-haired woman with reading glasses and no patience for nonsense, took her seat and opened the probate file. And I folded my hands on top of my grandmother's will and waited for the door to open. The hearing began the way these things do, dry and procedural, and my sister sat through it with a small, confident smile because she believed she'd already won the only battle that mattered. In her mind, the will had burned in my apartment. She'd made sure of it. She thought this hearing would come down to her word against mine about what Nana wanted. A whisper contest, her favorite kind, with our mother nodding along and the family stacked on her side. Her lawyer, a bored man in a shiny suit, opened by claiming the decedent's most recent will could not be produced, that the only known copy had been lost in a fire, and that the estate should therefore be distributed under the prior will, which split everything evenly. He said it smoothly, like a man laying down a winning card. Across the room, I watched my mother's shoulders relax. I watched Delia's smile widen just slightly. The judge looked over her glasses and asked the question that the whole day turned on, the same one I'd been waiting for. "Is the original of the most recent will available to this court, or is it not?" Delia's lawyer said, with theatrical regret, that it was not, that it had unfortunately been destroyed. And my sister actually let out a small breath. Relief. Victory. The tension going out of her like she'd crossed a finish line. She turned her head and gave me a look I'll remember for the rest of my life, a look that said, "You should have just let it go." I met her eyes, and I didn't look away, and I didn't smile. I reached into my folder. Nora rose beside me and said the words that changed the temperature of the entire room. "Your Honor, the original will is available. We have it here." I stood and I set my grandmother's original will on the table where the light from the tall windows fell across the raised notary seal, and the room went so quiet I could hear the clock on the back wall. Nora carried it to the bench. The judge examined it, turned the pages, ran her thumb over the embossed seal exactly as I had in the vault, and said, "This appears to be a properly executed original." Then Nora placed beside it a second document, her office's independently retained copy, and the capacity evaluation signed by Nana's physician on the day of the signing, and the notarized statements of the two independent witnesses. One clean stack, built over months, impossible to argue with. I watched my sister's face come apart in slow motion. The confidence drained out of it first, then the color, then something underneath both of those, a dawning, sickening understanding. The will she had burned my apartment to destroy was sitting on a courtroom table, whole, real, its seal unmarked, because it had never been in my apartment at all. Her lawyer leaned over and whispered something urgent, and she didn't seem to hear him. Somewhere behind me, I heard a relative murmur, half to herself. She always did land on her feet. This time, it wasn't a dismissal. This time, it came out as something closer to awe, and I let it settle over the room. I did not gloat. I kept my voice flat, and even when the judge asked me to confirm the chain of the document, and I explained simply that I'm a nurse, that I'd document everything, that I'd had the will notarized and secured in a bank vault months before Nana passed because she'd asked me to keep it safe. Plain facts, plainly said. My mother had gone white beside Delia. My father, 2 rows back, had his eyes closed, and my sister was staring at the will like it was a living thing that had crawled out of the ashes she'd made, which, in a way, it had. But we weren't done, because the will only explained the why. It didn't explain the fire, and Frank Delgado was already rising from his seat by the aisle. Delia's lawyer, drowning now, tried to change the subject the only way he could, by attacking the source. He said the will's existence didn't prove the old woman's intent, that my caregiving gave me undue influence, that a vulnerable elderly woman had been isolated and worked on by the very person who stood to gain. It was Delia's whisper campaign dressed up in legal language, and for a second it hung in the air. Then Nora, unhurried, produced the physician's capacity evaluation again and read the relevant line aloud, that Ruth Myers was of entirely sound mind and understood the disposition of her estate, signed and dated the day of the signing by her own doctor of 20 years. The undue influence story died right there on the record. And into that silence, the judge, who had noticed the man in the gray jacket, asked who he was. Delgado stood and identified himself, county fire investigator, and said there was an active criminal arson investigation directly bearing on why this estate's most recent will had supposedly been lost in a fire. He was careful, the way a man who testifies for a living is careful. He said the criminal case would be tried in its own courtroom, not this one, and that he was here only so the record would reflect why a document everyone had been told burned by accident had in fact been targeted. The judge asked him to summarize the basis, nothing more, and noted for the record that she was not trying the criminal matter today. And Frank Delgado, in the flat, unbothered voice of a man who has done this 100 times, gave the court the shape of it, not the whole file. A single point of origin in the corner where I kept my papers. A confirmed accelerant. A witness caught on camera entering the unit the night before. And a personal item recovered from that origin, later identified as belonging to Delia Prewitt. He set each fact down like a stone, plainly, and said the details would be proven where they belonged, at a criminal trial. But the shape was enough. With every fact, the room seemed to lean further away from my sister, benches of relatives who'd come to watch me shamed now turning, slowly, to stare at her. My mother's hand had come up to her mouth. Delia had stopped breathing. And the story she'd built, the confident smile, the whisper court, the certainty that I would fold, collapsed inward all at once, and the woman who had set the fire finally understood that everything she'd tried to burn had survived. And then my sister broke. She shot up from her chair so hard it screeched across the floor and toppled, and every ounce of the calm venom she'd hissed at me in the hallway detonated at full volume in that courtroom. "You think you deserve it?" she screamed, pointing at me across the room, her lawyer grabbing uselessly at her sleeve. "You always have to win. You always have to be the good one, the one who stayed. Well, I have children, I'm losing my house, and she left it all to you." Her voice cracked and climbed, and she said the thing that no amount of legal defense could ever pull back into her mouth. It was supposed to be the house, not you. The house was supposed to burn, not. None of this was supposed to touch you. The words hit the room like a dropped plate. It was supposed to be the house, not you. Her lawyer was on his feet now, talking over her, all but shouting at her to stop, and the judge was calling for order.